Don't ever give your mobile number to a stranger. He's been calling me constantly ever since we first met. Now he wants an answer. Where did all this begin? Oh yes, that party. Another art world bash. There I was, trying to find the bar, hoping to see a familiar face. And then the inevitable happened. That person with a program idea.
Hi, how are you? I wanted to talk to you about the Andy Warhol authentication board, and I thought that maybe the BBC might be interested in looking into this, or I could discuss it with you.
What do you mean denied?
It's a $2 million painting, and they decide what is real and what isn't real.
What is it exactly?
Well, it's Joe Simon, and
you got a painting?
And I have a painting, and it's been denied. And I found a lot of other people's works have been denied as well, and I thought that maybe...
His name was Joe Simon. From the fragments I could hear above the noise, the story he had to tell was very strange. But then every story you hear is strange when it's about this man, the artist, Andy Warhol.
Oh, this is so glamorous.
I was upstairs, RSVPing to all tomorrow's parties, when the phone rang. Having received a mass of information by post, I took a wild guess as to the identity of the caller.
Joe.
Joe Simon is an American film producer living in London. He purchased an early Warhol self-portrait in the late 80s, but when he tried to sell it 12 years later, he was told that it wasn't by Warhol. Had I read all the documentation he'd sent me?
I did.
Over the last 4 years, Simon has immersed himself in the life and work of Andy Warhol and the business dealings of the artist's estate to discover the true history of his painting and to prove that it's the real thing. But there's a problem. Simon's painting has been denied by something called the Andy Warhol Art Authentication Board, which was set up 6 years after he bought his picture. In their view, it doesn't qualify as a genuine Warhol, despite its having been previously authenticated by this man, Fred Hughes. Hughes was president of the Warhol Foundation and responsible for authenticating the artist's work before the board was established. I had to admit something didn't smell right, so I agreed to meet with Simon. It was that or change my phone number.
So here is a picture of it.
So this is self-portrait, 64.
And it says signed on the stretcher, provenance, private collection, and it says the authenticity of the work has been confirmed on the reverse of the canvas by Fred Hughes of the Warhol Foundation, New York. Of checking before I bought it, because it was a lot of money, and you know, most people would go and buy a house, and I didn't. I went and bought a Warhol, and I bought it because I knew Andy quite well, and I liked the image.
How old were you when you met Warhol?
I was a teenager.
And you bought it for $190,000?
$195,000.
Sorry, $195,000.
Yeah, that's a...
And what were you selling it for?
Well, I went to sell it in 2001 and for just under $2 million.
The sale was scuppered. The authentication board's denial of Simon's picture. Ironically, he received the bad news in an envelope bearing this stamp, the US mail's tribute to a great American artist. It was getting late, but it was getting interesting. Time to check out some real Warhols.
Drop in on Tate and see what they've got.
Authenticating Warhol is a complex business because he revolutionized the way art was made. He gave up hand-painted canvases very early on in his career. This rare example recently sold for $25 million. Andy moved into making multiples. He called his workspace the factory and produced pictures accordingly, on an assembly line with the help of assistants. He then began using mass production techniques like silkscreen printing so that he could radically up production of his work. Found photographs were simply screened onto canvas, blurring the boundaries between fine art painting and printing. Evidence of the artist's hand at work began to recede until it all but vanished in a frenzy of activity. I found myself back at the office. What I wanted to know was, how do you go about authenticating the work of an artist who made so much so mechanically? And how could Joe Simon's painting be authentic in 1988, but not now? I had to admit I was hooked. It was time for some answers. Maybe I'd get them in New York, from the people who really knew and worked with Warhol. My first stop was the apartment of art historian John Richardson, a regular visitor to the factory who'd been painted by Andy and was a close friend. When you met him, John, what was your impression of Andy and how he went about making his art?
Well, when I first met him, it was in the bad old days of the factory, when Andy was the sort of still center of all this drug-taking and lunacy, and you'd go to the factory and there'd be opera on full blast in one bit and then heavy metal rock in another bit, and everything, there's this jangling and this sort of furor around him. And there was this, there at the middle was Andy saying very little, just hi, gosh, wow, that was about it. It just seemed to me such an amazing contrast. What's so interesting about Andy is that he was one of the first modern artists to react against abstract expressionism, where the artist was smearing himself and his psyche all over the canvas, and the brushstrokes meant everything, and the gesture meant everything. And with Andy, it was exactly the reverse. It didn't matter whether he did it or added the brushstrokes or one of his assistants. I mean, he used to do these silk screens, and assistants would write and run off a few copies for themselves. But did that make them any less authentic than the ones which they ran off for Andy during the day?
This is the famous Chelsea Hotel. I've come here to meet Paul Morrissey, one of Andy's closest collaborators. Morrissey not only directed most of Andy's movies from the late 60s, but was his manager for nearly 10 years, never missing a single day at the factory. Paul.
Alan!
Come up, we're upstairs. Paul has his own views about Andy's hands-off approach.
Well, I knew what he did nothing. So it was a real opportunity to do whatever had to be done. And he just had to show up and go places, and that's basically what I did most of the early years, was during the day was arrange for him to go somewhere and show up.
So how involved was he in pictures or in silk screening images onto canvas?
He himself very seldom got involved in even the pushing the paint through the silk screen. He didn't mix the colors even, they just came out of the bucket and they smeared them on. Later, when other people did his silk screens the last years of his life, I was so impressed. I said, oh, Andy, look at those colors. You're getting very artistic. He said, oh, I don't do that. They do that. They do that downtown. He couldn't care whether it was or it wasn't. His limitations were gigantic, but they were focused. And certainly it paid off.